Welcome back. We've seen that microcredit is only a modest help and that insurance and savings may matter more. Now, in Part D, we reach what many believe is the real revolution in financial inclusion, one that arrived not from banks or non-profits, but from mobile phones. This is digital finance, and it may be quietly achieving what decades of microcredit could not. Let me tell you the story that reshaped how economists think about financial inclusion, the story of M-Pesa. In 2007, in Kenya, a mobile network launched a service called M-Pesa that let millions of people send and store money using nothing more than a basic mobile phone. No smartphone, no bank account required. You could turn cash into digital money at a local agent, send it across the country by text message, and store it safely. And its impact turned out to be extraordinary. Suri and Jack, in a celebrated 2016 study in the journal Science, found that M-Pesa lifted around 194,000 Kenyan households, about 2% of the entire country, out of poverty, with the effect strongest for female-headed households. Now, here's the part that should make you sit up, because it overturns the whole microcredit paradigm. How did M-Pesa do this? Not through credit at all. The channels were cheaper money transfers, better risk sharing between family and friends. You can instantly send money to a relative hit by an emergency, and more savings. In other words, it was payments and savings infrastructure, not lending, that moved people out of poverty. And that is the punchline of this entire chapter, really. The humble ability to move and store money cheaply may matter more for the poor than microcredit ever did. We spent decades obsessed with lending, and it turned out the killer app was letting people send a text message payment to their mother. This image shows mobile money in everyday action, an agent of the kind you'll find on street corners across Kenya and much of Africa. These agents are the crucial human link in the system, and they're worth understanding. They act as the bridge between physical cash and digital money. You hand the agent cash and they credit your phone, or you go the other way and cash out. This vast network of small local agents, often existing shopkeepers, is what makes the system reach people the formal banking system never touched. Notice how different this is from a bank branch, with its marble floors and opening hours. It's a corner kiosk, run by a neighbor, open whenever the shop is. That's the genius of the model. It built a financial network on top of infrastructure, phones and small shops, that already existed everywhere, even in the poorest places. No need to build banks, just use the phones and the shopkeepers people already had. But digital finance has a darker side too, and we'd be irresponsible not to face it. The same smartphones that enable cheap payments also enable instant algorithmic nano loans, tiny loans approved in seconds by an app, using your phone data to assess you at massive scale. The promise is obvious: credit for people who could never get it before, instantly and cheaply to deliver. But the peril is just as real. These loans often carry high fees and opaque terms, and their sheer ease of access can fuel exactly the over-indebtedness we saw earlier. People taking loan after loan with a few taps, sinking into debt they don't fully understand. In other words, the Andhra Pradesh lesson returns, now in digital form. The technology has changed, but the fundamental danger has not. Easy credit without protection can trap the poor. And digital credit can be even more dangerous. Because it's faster, more frictionless, and harder to regulate. You can dig yourself into a hole at 3 in the morning from your phone. So the lesson bears repeating. Consumer protection is absolutely essential. The very speed and reach that make digital credit so promising are exactly what make it so perilous without strong safeguards. Now let's look at a related fintech innovation that connects our microfinance story to the wider financial world. Peer-to-peer lending, also called marketplace lending. The idea is to use an online platform to match borrowers directly with investors, bypassing the bank's balance sheet entirely. Instead of depositing your money in a bank that then lends it out, you lend directly to borrowers through a platform. The pioneers were firms like Lending Club and Prosper in the United States and Funding Circle in the United Kingdom. and the model then spread to emerging markets. The promise is appealing: wider access to credit for the underserved and cheaper loans, achieved through technology and disintermediation, cutting out the middleman bank. Think of it as a fintech cousin of microfinance. Same fundamental goal of reaching borrowers, the traditional banks neglect. Same use of clever mechanisms to do it. But, and here's the theme that will run through the rest of this video, it faces the same old credit risk problems that have challenged every lender since the dawn of banking. New technology, same ancient question. How do you tell a good borrower from a bad one and get repaid? Let's be precise about how peer-to-peer lending actually works, because the structure matters. There are three players. First, the borrowers. They apply online and the platform rates and prices them, assigning an interest rate based on their assessed risk. Second, the platform itself. It screens applicants, sets the rate, and services the loan, collecting payments, all in exchange for a fee. And third, the investors. They fund the loans directly and, crucially, they bear the credit risk. If a borrower defaults, it's the investor who loses, not the platform. And that last point reveals the essential feature of the whole model. The platform intermediates information, not its own balance sheet. A traditional bank takes your deposit, lends it out, and bears the risk itself. Its own capital is on the line. A peer-to-peer platform takes none of that risk onto its own books. It just matches borrowers and investors and takes a fee for the service. That difference is fundamental, and it drives both the promise and the problems, because it changes who has the incentive to screen borrowers carefully. If the platform doesn't bear the losses, how hard will it really work to weed out bad borrowers? That question is at the heart of the research we'll see in a moment. Let's weigh peer-to-peer lending honestly, because, like everything in this chapter, it's neither miracle nor menace. On the advantages side, it offers access for thin-file and underserved borrowers, people with little formal credit history whom banks reject. It's fast, low cost, and fully digital. It fills gaps left by banks, especially after the financial crisis when banks pulled back. And it lets investors earn a yield directly, cutting out the bank's margin. Those are real benefits, but the risks are equally real. Borrowers can face high rates if they're deemed risky. There's serious adverse selection and information asymmetry. The platform may know less about borrowers than it thinks. Default rates are typically higher than on bank loans. And the sector often operates under light regulation, with genuine platform and liquidity risk. If the platform itself fails, or if investors all try to withdraw at once, the whole thing can seize up. So peer-to-peer lending is a genuine innovation that expands access. But it doesn't repeal the laws of credit risk. It reshuffles who bears the risk and how borrowers are screened. But somebody still has to bear the losses when loans go bad, and that somebody is the investor. So what does rigorous research actually find about whether peer-to-peer lending works? 4 studies give us a nuanced and consistent picture. Valley and Zhang in 2019 found that platforms which produce more information, better data and screening, reduce adverse selection and improve investor returns. Information is the key ingredient. Derur, Pelizon and Thakor in 2022 found that peer-to-peer lending is mostly bottom fishing. It funds riskier borrowers than banks do, picking up the customers banks turned down. Tang in 2019 showed a subtle dual relationship. Peer-to-peer substitutes for bank credit for marginal borrowers, taking the customers banks reject, yet complements banks for small loans. And Hertzberg, Liberman and Paravicini in 2018 found a lovely result. Borrowers self-select on loan maturity. The ones who choose longer loans tend to be hidden higher default risks, which reveals private information the platform can exploit. Pull these together, and the unifying lesson is clear, and it echoes everything in this chapter. Information and screening, not the technology alone, decide whether peer-to-peer lending works. The app and the algorithm are just tools. Whether the model succeeds or fails comes down to the same thing it always has in finance: how well you can gather information about borrowers and separate the good from the bad. Technology changes the how. It never abolishes the fundamental problem. Let's recap. Digital finance may be the real breakthrough for the poor. M-Pesa lifted around 2% of Kenya out of poverty, not through credit, but through cheap payments and savings, suggesting payments infrastructure beats microcredit. But digital credit revives the over-indebtedness danger in faster form, so consumer protection is essential. And peer-to-peer lending, the fintech cousin of microfinance, expands access, but faces the same eternal credit risk problems, where, as the research shows, information and screening, not technology, decide success. In our final video, we look at the state of financial inclusion, reach a verdict on microfinance, and wrap up the entire course. See you there.